Hey everyone, welcome back. We all want to be in the know, right? To grasp those big ideas that are shaping the world, but without getting lost in a maze of academic jargon. And today, well, we're going deep, really deep, into Karl Marx, the thinker whose theories sparked revolutions and whose critiques, well, they continue to ignite debate even today.
We've got some fascinating excerpts here, material that'll give you a solid grasp of Marx's life, those key ideas that he developed, and why they continue to resonate, sometimes uncomfortably so, even in our modern world.
All right, let's set the stage. Picture Europe in 1848. It's a tinderbox, politically and socially. The Communist Manifesto, bam, it drops and revolts explode across the continent, from Sicily to Warsaw, Paris, Vienna, you name it. Intense upheaval, right?
Absolutely, and to really grasp the atmosphere, Clara Schumann, the composer Robert Schumann's wife, she offers this incredibly vivid and frankly chilling picture of the brutal end of the Dresden Rebellion. Students summarily executed, people thrown from windows. It really underscores the fierce yearning for equality and the equally fierce lengths those in power would go to suppress it.
Yeah, it's a brutal backdrop against which Marx steps in with his solution: communism. And as the 20th century tragically demonstrated, that solution, well, it had some serious flaws when put into practice. But the thing is, those fundamental questions he raised about social justice, those haven't faded. You see extreme wealth coexisting alongside grinding poverty. I mean, look at Mumbai or Plus Sao Paulo. And even within the wealthiest capitalist centers, that gap between the haves and have-nots, it's still there.
It is, and that stark contrast, that almost obscene juxtaposition of immense wealth and desperate poverty, was something Marx analyzed with an intensity that's still relevant, especially when we consider the challenges we're facing today.
So that brings us to our mission, our deep dive today. We're going to unpack Marx's core ideas, understand that explosive context in which they were forged, and see why they still spark such heated discussion. Think of it as your express lane to understanding this undeniably complex and controversial thinker.
A shortcut, a deep dive into the heart of Marx.
Exactly. So, first things first, let's get a sense of the man himself. Where did he come from? What shaped his thinking, his early life, and those initial influences?
Well, Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, Germany. Now, Trier is an interesting place. It's near the Luxembourg border, nestled in the Moselle River Valley, a region, as any wine lover will tell you, famous for its vineyards. And I think it's fascinating to consider how this location, being somewhat cosmopolitan and surrounded by this culture of wine production, might have subtly influenced his early outlook on the world.
Wine country and open borders.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a potentially broad worldview from the get-go. But, I mean, he wasn't exactly born into hardship, was he?
No, not at all. He came from a comfortable, I'd even say bourgeois, middle-class family. His father was a successful lawyer, and on top of that, he owned some vineyards. And one of Marx's uncles, well, he was a founder of the electronics giant Philips.
Okay, so not your typical starving revolutionary backstory here.
Yeah.
But his family, it wasn't all, I don't know, straightforward, was it? There were some interesting dynamics at play.
Oh, absolutely. You see, his father, who descended from a long line of rabbis, he actually converted to Christianity, and this was largely to improve his social standing. It was a fairly common move at the time. I think Mendelssohn, Heine, they did the same. And he, Marx's father, that is, really embraced European culture, had a particular fondness for Kant, for that philosophical depth, but also for Voltaire, for his wit, his sharp critique of everything, really.
A blend of serious thought and, well, a healthy dose of questioning authority. It's got to rub off, right?
Well, likely, yes. And you have to consider the political climate, too. It wasn't exactly peaceful.
Right, because this was the Rhineland, right?
It was, and the Rhineland had been annexed by, let's call it what it was, an autocratic Prussia back in 1815. And Marx's father, well, he was actually involved in a political group that was pushing for a constitution. So even within this comfortable home, there were these undercurrents of political engagement, a real desire for change simmering beneath the surface.
Okay, so politically charged atmosphere at home, a father pushing back against authority. Are there any, I don't know, any good stories about young Karl, anything that hinted at the revolutionary he'd become?
Well, there's this much-discussed anecdote about him forcing his sisters to eat mud pies. It's likely, though, a single incident that's been blown way out of proportion, become a field day for overanalyzing every little detail. Honestly, his university years offer clearer glimpses of his, let's say, rebellious spirit. even if it was just youthful exuberance at that point.
Yeah, university, that's often where those intellectual sparks really ignite or maybe explode, in Marx's case.
Perhaps. At the University of Bonn, he had a reputation. He was an avid reader, loved his wine. He was even involved in a tavern brawl that left him with a dueling scar. And he managed to dodge military service, probably with a, shall we say, questionable medical certificate.
Sounds like he was sowing some wild oats, but with a healthy appetite for intellectual pursuits, too.
Exactly. And then he moved on to the University of Berlin, and it was there that his focus really shifted more intensely towards philosophy, and in particular, the works of, well, a giant in the field, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Now, even though Marx initially disliked Hegel, he thought he was basically glorifying the Prussian state. Hegel's ideas, they became hugely influential on his development.
Okay, so Hegel, massive figure in philosophy. What was it about his work that proved to be so formative for Marx?
Well, Hegel's philosophy was a truly massive system, all-encompassing, really, and he saw history and thought progressing through this process that he called the dialectic. Think of it as a constant interplay of opposing ideas. You've got a thesis, right, and it encounters its opposite, its antithesis, and out of that conflict, out of that clash, emerges a synthesis, which then becomes a new thesis, and on it goes.
It's a constant evolution through conflict, kind of a struggle for self-realization, you could say.
Yes, precisely. And Hegel saw history itself unfolding in this way. Laws, governments, they reflect the evolving spirit, the ethos of a people. There's this dialectical link between the state and its citizens, a relationship he viewed as both logical, unfolding in this rational way, but also organic, like a living, growing thing.
Okay, this is getting pretty abstract. But Hegel, wasn't he seen as well pretty pro-establishment, supportive of the existing order?
Yeah, you're right. His emphasis on this grand hierarchical system, well, it resonated with the Prussian authorities. It kind of justified their whole bureaucratic structure. He even made the statement that's interpreted as God is dead, but he was referring to this limited Christian God being replaced by what he called the absolute spirit. And because his writing was so complex, so dense, this potentially blasphemous idea, it basically flew under the radar. No one really noticed. That's how layered and complex his work was.
So if Hegel was, seen as backing the establishment, why would a future revolutionary like Marx find him so compelling? Why not just reject him outright?
Because while Hegel's conclusions were definitely conservative, his method, that dialectic, it was revolutionary. Marx might have been repulsed by Hegel's focus on the spiritual, his religiosity, and, what Marx saw as a fundamentally conservative stance, but he saw the power in this idea of historical progress being driven by internal contradictions, by this constant clash of opposing forces.
Okay, so Marx was taking Hegel's engine, this powerful idea of the dialectic, but he wanted to steer it in a completely different direction. Who else played a crucial role in shaping his thinking?
Ludwig Feuerbach was another absolutely crucial influence. Now, Feuerbach was a humanist, a moralist who really moved beyond traditional theology and even beyond the more orthodox interpretations of Hegel.
What was Feuerbach's main contribution to this mix, to Marx's developing thought?
Well, Feuerbach argued that religion, Christianity in particular, but really all religions, are fundamentally about humanity's relationship with its own essential nature. He said that the attributes we give to God, things like power, wisdom, love, these are actually projections of our own human qualities. Knowing God, for Feuerbach, was all about understanding ourselves.
So God's like a mirror reflecting humanity's best traits back at itself.
Yeah, that's the core idea. And Feuerbach took Hegel's concept of the absolute spirit and gave it let's say, a materialist interpretation. He argued it was just humanity's self-consciousness, our awareness of our own nature, nothing more, nothing less.
So Feuerbach brings Hegel down to earth, makes it more about human beings, here and now.
Exactly. And Marx embraced this materialism, this focus on the material world as the basis of reality. But he also criticized Feuerbach for lacking, a sense of historical and dialectical movement. He thought Feuerbach saw human nature and society as kind of static, not constantly evolving through these internal contradictions.
Okay, so for Marx, nothing's fixed, everything's in flux, driven by these opposing forces, constantly clashing. So we've got Hegel's dialectic, we've got Feuerbach's materialism. Anyone else in the mix that really influenced the young Marx?
Well, the left Hegelians, they were a group who took Hegel's ideas and pushed them in pretty radical directions. Max Stirner was particularly influential.
What made Stirner stand out? What were his main ideas?
Stirner was an advocate for this extreme form of egoism. He said that consciousness creates reality, and he denied the objective existence of social constructs, things like class, the state, even the idea of a shared humanity. These were all fictions for him. The individual ego, that was the only true reality.
That's a pretty radical individualist perspective.
Yeah.
How did Marx engage with that, with someone like Stirner?
He was definitely intrigued by Stirner's emphasis on the link between consciousness and this socio-historical reality. But he fundamentally reversed Stirner's premise. For Marx, it wasn't consciousness creating material circumstances. No, it was the other way around. Material circumstances, the way we produce and live, that shapes our consciousness.
Ah, that classic chicken and egg question, right?
Oh,
And Marx is firmly in the camp of the material world shaping our thoughts.
precisely.
Okay, so Marx is absorbing these potent ideas, really wrestling with them, struggling to synthesize them. What emerges? What's his core philosophical project at this point?
He's trying to synthesize these influential ideas, right? You have Hegel's dialectic, Feuerbach's materialism, the radicalism of the left Hegelians. He's trying to bring them together into this comprehensive materialist philosophy, but one that's still driven by these dialectical forces, this constant clash and resolution. His goal, and he famously put it this way, was to turn Hegel upside down. He wanted to ground that dialectical process not in the realm of ideas, but in the material conditions of human existence.
That sounds like a philosophical earthquake brewing. What was his first major output? His first big statement in this new direction?
His doctoral thesis. And interestingly, he focused on Prometheus, the Greek mythological figure, the one who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. For Marx, Prometheus was this potent symbol of rebellion, of the struggle for human liberation. It's a pretty clear metaphor for his own intellectual ambitions and, well, for the impact he hoped his ideas would have.
Stealing fire for humanity. Yeah, that's a pretty grand self-assessment. Okay, so he's laid his philosophical foundations. What did he do with them? Did he go straight into revolutionary activity?
He actually hoped for a university career, a nice, respectable position. But the political climate under Friedrich Wilhelm IV, it became... Exactly. He became the editor of this liberal newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne.
Now, with all that dense philosophical training, was he actually any good at journalism? Could he write for the average person?
Surprisingly, yes. He turned out to be an excellent journalist. He could coin these memorable phrases, cut through complex issues, make things accessible and effective. He even picked up the nickname the Moor because of his dark complexion and that thick beard he had.
The Moor. Yeah, that's a pretty striking image. Was the Rheinische Zeitung successful under his leadership?
Oh, it was a huge thorn in the side of the Prussian authorities. Circulation tripled, made it the most widely read paper in Prussia. It was a genuine voice of opposition, challenging the status quo.
It sounds like he was making some serious waves, ruffling feathers in high places.
He was, but, and this is classic Marx, his own political views continued to evolve, always taking this dialectical path. He'd attack the authorities, then turn his criticism on the liberal opposition, and even take aim at his own left-wing colleagues, the ones he saw as just armchair revolutionaries.
Making enemies on all sides, eh? What happened to the Rheinische Zeitung in the end?
The Prussian authorities, they had enough. In 1843, they shut it down.
End of an era. So what did Marx do? Did he go underground, become a full-blown revolutionary?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. In a move that, on the surface, seems totally contradictory, he decides to settle down, marry his childhood sweetheart, Jenny von Westphalen, and at the same time, he chooses to leave his homeland and go into exile.
Talk about a fork in the road. Okay, who is Jenny? Fill us in.
Jenny was known as the most beautiful girl in Trier, no small feat, and she came from an aristocratic family, one with deep political connections. Her father was a high-ranking government official, and her brother, well, he was a pretty repressive interior minister.
So she's marrying a guy who's, let's face it, potentially dangerous, definitely unconventional. What motivated her to do that?
Jenny was no pushover. She was intelligent, well-read, probably pretty bored with the constraints of provincial aristocratic life. She wanted something more, something broader, a life that engaged her intellectually in a way that Trier just couldn't offer.
So she's not just looking for comfort and stability, she's looking for something more.
Exactly. And theirs was a marriage based on love for sure, but also this deep intellectual connection, a bond that would endure through all the hardships they would face. And there would be many.
Okay, they're married. His career as an editor is over. Where do they head?
Paris. At that time, it was the absolute center of European revolutionary thought and activity. It had already seen major revolutions, 1789, 1830. It was a magnet for every kind of leftist group and thinker
A
imaginable.
perfect breeding ground for those radical ideas.
Oh, it was. And in Paris, Marx is thinking it goes through another major transformation. He becomes convinced that revolution isn't just a possibility, it's a necessity, and he fully embraces communism.
So this is where the mature revolutionary is really taking shape.
It seems so.
Mm.
And he becomes intensely focused on understanding how a revolution can actually happen. He realizes it needs both a comprehensive intellectual framework and a deep analysis of economic systems.
So economics becomes central to his thinking at this point.
Absolutely. And he really digs into the works of the classical political economists, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo. But at the same time, he's developing his own philosophical understanding of, well, of how we actually know things, what we call epistemology.
Epistemology, that sounds pretty academic.
It is. But in simple terms, epistemology is just the branch of philosophy that asks, how do we know what we know? What counts as knowledge? What are the limits of what we can possibly understand?
So it's a philosophy of knowledge itself.
Exactly. Now, while it's not considered to be one of the strongest or most original aspects of his thought, Marx's epistemology is crucial. It's like the foundation for his later theories about society and economics.
Okay, so how did he approach this question of knowledge? What was his take?
Well, consistent with his materialist outlook, he believed that all knowledge, it all comes from our experience of the material world, from our senses, from what we see, hear, touch, and so on.
So experience is the foundation of knowledge. Nothing more, nothing less.
Essentially, yes. But Marx, he differed from some earlier materialists who saw sensation as this passive reception of information. He saw perception as this active interaction between the subject, the person knowing, and the object, the thing being known. And in this act of knowing, he argued, we transform the object, but the object also shapes us in turn.
So knowledge isn't just passively observing the world, it's an active engagement that changes both the observer and the observed.
That's the core idea. And for Marx, knowledge wasn't about discovering some absolute, unchanging truth about the world. It was about developing practical methods for manipulating and controlling the material world, meeting our human needs.
So knowledge is a tool for action, a tool for change.
Exactly. And scientific knowledge especially, it allows us to impose order on nature, to manipulate it for our purposes, to predict how it's going to behave.
Okay, so where does this leave this idea of absolute truth? This notion that there's a single unchanging truth out there.
Marx was pretty skeptical of that. He famously wrote, whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question.
So truth is more about what works in practice than some abstract ideal.
Yeah, it's a simplification, but it captures that pragmatic side of his epistemology. And this leads directly to one of his most famous pronouncements. It's the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, and he says, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
Change it. There it is, that activist revolutionary spirit distilled into a single sentence. Okay, so he's formulating his theory of knowledge in Paris. What happens next?
This is where a crucial partnership begins to develop, his relationship with Friedrich Engels.
Ah, yes, the indispensable Engels.
More than just a partner, Engels became Marx's, his closest intellectual collaborator and probably his most reliable source of financial and emotional support. And it starts because, to make a living in Paris, Marx took on the role of editor for this journal called the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher. And Engels, he contributed to it. That's how they connect more closely.
Okay, so what's Engels doing in Paris at this point? I mean, what's his story?
Engels, he came from a relatively wealthy family. I mean, his father owned cotton mills, both in the Rhineland and in, of all places, Manchester, England. And Engels himself, he actually worked in the family business right there in Manchester.
So a capitalist who becomes a communist, that's a fascinating trajectory.
He was a man of, seemingly contradictions, rebel against his family's conservative views, but worked for their firm, dropped out of secondary school when he was only 17, but later learned, are you ready for this, 24 languages. I mean, the guy was brilliant. And he was this respectable businessman, member of the Manchester Cotton Exchange, but lived openly with his working class Irish girlfriend, Mary Burns.
Mary Burns, she sounds like a key figure in his journey towards more radical politics.
Absolutely. She opened his eyes to the horrific living conditions of the working class in Manchester's Irish slums. And this experience, it was the basis for his groundbreaking book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. It's a powerful indictment of industrial capitalism, really lays bare its costs.
Can you give us a sense of what he describes in that book? What was he seeing?
Widespread filth, extreme overcrowding, a level of dehumanization that's hard to imagine. I mean, he describes these streets where masses of refuse, awful and sickening dirt lie among standing pools of stagnant water. Houses so dilapidated, he says, the race that lives in these ruinous cottages behind broken windows, mended with oilskins, sprung doors, and rotten doorposts must really have reached the lowest stage of humanity. And in these incredibly small dwellings, I mean, sometimes just 2 rooms, he notes an average of 20 people were living there.
Wow, that's just, I mean, those conditions are just shocking.
They are. And there's this anecdote, it's telling, where Ingalls is, discussing these slums with a fellow businessman, and the guy just shrugs and says, and yet there's a great deal of money made here. Good day, Mr. Ingalls. That casual disregard, that callousness towards human suffering and the pursuit of profit, it really stuck with Ingalls.
Yeah, I can see how that would have a profound impact. So how did this shared outrage, this sense of, well, of injustice, solidify the bond between Marx and Engels?
Well, they had actually met briefly before this when Marx was editing the Rheinische Zeitung, but it wasn't a very memorable encounter. It was really when Engels submitted some really insightful articles to the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher that Marx recognized a kindred spirit, someone who shared his critical perspective on society.
And that second meeting, the one in Paris, what was that like?
Oh, that was when the real connection was made. Engels visited Marx, and it was immediate. This deep intellectual and personal bond formed. Over just 10 days, it blossomed.
So they found in each other the intellectual soulmate, maybe even the revolutionary comrade they each needed.
Absolutely. And Engels became Marx's most trusted confidant, really, his most unwavering supporter. He provided financial and emotional stability, something Marx desperately needed throughout his often turbulent life. And what's remarkable is they managed to maintain this friendship without the kind of, the bitter quarrels that Marx had with so many others.
And that says a lot about their compatibility, their shared vision.
Yeah.
So with this powerful partnership formed, did Marx's, his perpetually precarious financial situation, did that finally improve?
Not really. Despite his marriage and the birth of his first daughter, Marx continued to live this life of relative poverty in Paris. It's almost like he had a psychological resistance to achieving conventional social respectability or financial security.
So it wasn't just bad luck. It was almost a chosen state, a rejection of bourgeois values, maybe.
It did seem to be more than just circumstance. While he certainly wasn't facing the absolute destitution of the working class he wrote about, his was this persistent struggle, the life of a perpetually broke, shall we say, gentleman scholar.
Okay, so they're in Paris, radical ideas are brewing, a powerful partnership is solidifying. What happens next in the Marx and Engels saga?
They start using the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher as a platform to spread their increasingly radical ideas. These were ideas that were, circulating in Germany within intellectual circles. And the Prussian authorities, they took notice. They started seizing copies of the journal and putting pressure on the French government to crack down on Marx.
So he's become a political target, someone to be silenced.
Exactly. And eventually the journal was shut down and Marx was expelled from France.
Kicked out of France. Where did he and his growing family go?
They moved to Brussels, Belgium. His family kept growing too. Jenny gave birth to a son there. And Engels, faithful as ever, followed Marx to Brussels. And it was in Brussels that they both joined this newly formed group called the Communist League.
The Communist League. I mean, that name carries a lot of historical weight. What was it? What was its significance at this time?
Well, the name might sound grand, but it was actually a fairly small group. But it provided Marx and Engels with a more organized platform for their ideas. And they were actually commissioned by the League to write a statement of its principles and aims.
And that statement, of course, became the Communist Manifesto, one of the most influential political documents ever written.
It did. And the name itself, I think it's a little misleading. There wasn't this unified mass communist party at this point. The Communist League, it was just one of several groups calling themselves communist.
So what was the goal of the manifesto? What were Marx and Engels trying to achieve with it?
They wanted to articulate the core tenets of communism, to provide a unified program that could, clearly distinguish it from all these other socialist and radical ideas that were floating around, often in very confused and, divergent forms. And it was incredibly successful. I mean, the Communist Manifesto, despite being relatively short, it's about 40 pages, became one of the most influential texts in history, right up there with the Bible and Shakespeare.
Talk about an intellectual blockbuster.
Yeah.
What are some of its most enduring lines, those core arguments that have really resonated through history?
Well, it opens with this incredibly dramatic line. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And Engels, he initially defines communism as the doctrine of the conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat.
Right, the proletariat, that's the working class, those who have nothing to sell but their labor.
Exactly. And the manifesto argues that this emancipation, it'll be achieved through the abolition of private property. It has to be replaced by communal ownership of the means of production. And Marx lays out his central thesis in this really powerful line. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
Class struggle, the engine driving history, according to Marx.
Exactly. And he traces this struggle, from slavery to feudalism to the modern bourgeois society, where the capitalists, what he called the bourgeoisie, they dominate the proletariat, and they do this through their ownership of, factories, land, all the means of production.
So the constant battle between those who have and those who don't. Now, this is interesting. Didn't Marx actually acknowledge some positive aspects of the bourgeoisie, of what they had achieved?
He did, surprisingly. The manifesto, it offers this, it's almost a grudging acknowledgement of the bourgeoisie's, their revolutionary achievements. Marx wrote that they had created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. He goes on, he says, they've created wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals.
So progress, yes, but with a dark side.
Exactly. He argues that the bourgeoisie ruthlessly destroyed feudal ties, but they replaced them with, in his words, naked self-interest, with callous cash payment. He says they've drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. Personal worth reduced to exchange value, countless freedoms replaced with this single, and he calls it unconscionable, freedom, the freedom of trade.
A pretty scathing critique of the costs of capitalist progress.
It is. And he saw the human richness of pre-industrial life being replaced by the dehumanizing conditions of the industrial urban landscape. Individual freedoms are now tied to this free trade, this very thing he believes is exploiting the working class. It's a stark contrast to Adam Smith, who thought free trade benefited everyone.
So a fundamental disagreement with the dominant economic thinking of the time. What alternative does Marx offer? What does he propose?
He comes out swinging against classical economics, argues that the victory of the proletariat, that's what's going to lead to the first truly classless society. He believed that the market, that free trade, it inherently benefits the capitalist class at the expense of the exploited proletariat. And mere reform within the capitalist system, forget it, it's futile. Only a complete overthrow of the system will bring about real change.
So revolution is the only path forward. Does the manifesto in itself offer any specific reforms, things be done in the meantime?
It does. It actually includes a list of 10 immediate measures, and some of them, like a progressive income tax, the abolition of child labor, free public education, those have become pretty standard in many capitalist societies today. But others, like the abolition of private property and the centralization of credit and communication in the hands of the state, those were tried in communist states, and the results, they were often disastrous economically and socially.
Yeah, looking back, it's a mixed bag of proposals, some that have worked, others that haven't aged so well. Anything else in there that's maybe less well known?
There's one that's often overlooked, and it's pretty ironic given Marx's own history as an exile, right? He advocates for the confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels.
Yeah, that is pretty ironic.
Yeah.
And of course, the manifesto ends with that famous call to action, that rallying cry.
It does. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite.
Powerful words that would echo through decades and across continents. And all of this was finalized right before another wave of revolution swept across Europe.
Yeah, the Communist Manifesto, it was essentially finished in January 1848, just weeks before the eruption of that year of revolutions that spread across Europe. Talk about being in tune with the times.
It's incredible timing.
Yeah.
But did the manifesto itself directly cause these revolutions, or was it more a reflection of the existing revolutionary sentiment?
Well, the manifesto wasn't widely distributed at that point, so it couldn't have been a direct cause. It wasn't like people were reading it in the streets and then storming the barricades. But it definitely captured the mood, that widespread sense of discontent, the growing desire for radical change. Marx's ideas, they were definitely in the air, so to speak.
So what about Marx himself? What was his role in those 1848 revolutions?
Yeah.
Did he finally get a chance to put his revolutionary theories into practice?
Well, in a move that kind of contradicts the revolutionary fervor of the manifesto, Marx, urged on by Engels, actually turned his back on the Communist League. He returned to the Rhineland to revive the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, a new version of the newspaper he'd edited before.
Wait, he backed away from the revolutionary movement. Why? What is he thinking?
Classic Marx, another dialectical twist. He started writing articles condemning the uprisings. He was arguing that the working class should collaborate with the democratic bourgeoisie, at least initially, to achieve certain goals.
That's a pretty big tactical shift. How long did that last?
Not long. By September 1848, when Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm IV, he dissolves the Prussian assembly, Marx has changed his tune again. He's now advocating for armed resistance, fighting back against the counter-revolutionary forces.
So back to revolution. What was the outcome for him?
He gets arrested and put on trial for inciting rebellion. And in a pretty bold move, he defends himself by arguing that he wasn't preaching revolution. No, he was defending the existing laws, the Constitution, against the emperor's own revolutionary actions, against the dissolution of the assembly.
What? That's quite a defense. Did it work?
Amazingly, yes. He was acquitted by a sympathetic jury. They even reportedly thanked him after the trial.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.